Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to report to you about the issue of unmanned aerial vehicles, or as we know it in a more commonplace definition, drones. These are basically vehicles originally designed to be used for exclusive reconnaissance and long-term spying, mainly dispelling the use of espionage spies anymore. It's basically an explicit use of force to spy on particular individuals that a foreign country finds to be a imminent threat to their long-term existence. They have since shifted with an emphasis for striking and wiping out targets, and I will get into more exclusive terms of types of drones. They are vehicles controlled by a sensor operator and a pilot far away from where the operation is actually taking place. And they basically send commands via satellite communication to a communication antenna on the drone. There are two main types that are particularly of hot topic, topical discussions rather, and they are the Predator and Reaper drones. Predator drones are specifically fit into the definition that I prescribed about unmanned aerial vehicles. They are, as C defines it, as a surveillance platform with the potential to have weapon capabilities. And they're mostly used for live feed, reconnaissance, and video to allow personnel to monitor field action of enemy combatants. Actually, fun fact, the Osama bin Laden raid was actually viewed from a drone. Well, partially, and then the SEAL Team 6 had microscopic cameras in the helmets, but very, very interesting. That, before the burgeoning discussion on drones happened, this was being used to track the SEAL Team 6 mission. They are direct ancestors of Predator. These are MQ-9 Reaper drones, which are the hunter or killer drones. And they didn't become an offensive capability until about 2001, where in the state of Nevada, they effectively launched a missile in a test launch. And about a year afterwards, once the Predator drone was capable of firing off Hellfire missiles, it was first used in action in Yemen as one of the Al-Qaeda conspirators in the 9/11 attacks was fleeing from Saudi Arabia. A Predator drone successfully launched a Hellfire missile and blew up the vehicle that the member of Al-Qaeda was driving in. But it took a considerable amount of time than what the military had planned in its mission. And this became an issue because they actually had to have an F-15 on backup for its mission. And the military reported to the president and the National Security Council that there needed to be an innovative use of these drones. And this is what led to the MQ-9 Reaper drones. And they're the hunter-killer with surveillance capabilities. They speed twice as fast as Predator drones, and they're made for quick wipeouts and moving personnel and vehicles. And what's different about these MQ-9 Reaper drones is that they actually have two operating control teams, both in the field near the operation and both near the field far, far away in the surveillance community of America. The latter, the intelligence community team, will launch the operation and the piloting effects, and the team closest to the operation in the same the strike, and as well as the fact of longevity on the job. You don't want people in the Western Hemisphere spending a considerable amount of time surveying and trying to launch Hellfire missiles at these moving targets if they're not going to be attentive or physically adapt to it. In fact, our country has the most stringent measures for being a Predator drone and MQ-9 Reaper drone operator. The only downfall with MQ-9 Reapers is that they aren't able to locate other airplanes within its airspace, and so it makes in-air collisions more than likely. And they also tend to be very, very turbulent around mountainous areas, and that proves to be a problem in the FATA in Pakistan, the Federal Alliance Tribal area. Because it tends to be so turbulent, there have been a couple of mishaps with a drone becoming too turbulent. The next prominent definition is signature strike. Well, the difference between a signature strike and a surgical strike. A surgical strike happens to be one that affords the least collateral damage, and this will prove to be an issue once I come to provide some argumentative topic points that both sides can relate to in this area issue. But collateral damage basically meaning what debt do I incur? See, I had trouble explaining this and keeping the financial metaphor out of it. But regardless, it's what property can be taken out of a debt, and affording the least of that is clearly effective when civilian lives aren't unjustifiably taken in these operations. And a signature strike happens to be when there is an imminent combatant is targeted and they're able to wipe them out single-handedly. Drone strikes are, of course, prominent in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. In the Bush administration, there were about 400. During, I think, the middle of Obama's first term, there was up to 652 that people have approximated, because since they're covert operations, there is no precise number, well, unless the CIA, of course, keeps it on record, but which they might have to relate that information later if a district court and the Federal Circuit finds that they have to, because the ACLU demands under the Freedom of Information Act that information should be provided. That actually occurred last Friday. That happens to be one of drones. There's always breaking news. Another issue, or rather news, an update in the news being that a rapporteur for the UN subcommittee on counterterrorism and human rights came back from a special time in Pakistan and was studying drone strikes that the United States has been operating. And his report found that they are unjustifiable in the sense that Pakistan no longer accepts them, well, explicitly accepts them, and thus the U.S. has no right because there is no armed conflict with that nation. Recently, in February, Al-Qaeda actually had a tip sheet, or rather, recently we found out that Al-Qaeda had a tip sheet disseminated through its different alliances, aligned groups throughout Northern Africa and Arabia, that there are many different methods to avoid being detected by drones. The Al-Qaeda members in Mali were actually plastering mud onto their cars permanently because the drone would not pick up that it was like moving dirt, and that it would just register it as Earth, and thus they wouldn't be targeted. And the scientific reason behind that is that the car's heat would, through the sensors, seem as if it was the inner core's heat that was seeping through the crust of the Earth. There's also tips, hiding in trees and making fake, life-size figures in the distance and trying to ploy them to assume that they are imminent or combatants against the militants, whichever suits your fancy. Both are used in this discussion. The use of drones is proliferating. The U.S. and the U.K. And Israel are the only countries that have armed drones, or rather construct armed drones. There are as many as 50 nations who have been traded drones or are beginning to build drones for the sake of building up the military. So the use of them is clearly proliferating and will only continue to the next decade. There have been about 4,000 deaths of total from these drone strikes. The administration's abstract view of a militant is any male within the area of a armed combatant or an imminent threat to the United States. So it's used very, very abstractly, and that is very misleading to counts of innocent civilians. And so that number of roughly over 1,000 of combatants killed is very, very misleading to the effectiveness of drones, and that there have been close to 3,000 total in those three nations alone of innocent civilians killed. And that is very, very damaging to what people think of America as a global force in the world, and actually only increases what we have sought out to eradicate, hatred towards us. We also violate the same human rights laws that we promoted for with the engendering of the UN, the protection of humans in times of conflict. And we, for the sake of protecting ourselves, and fighting against people who do not believe in the sanctity of human rights in a democratic world, by stripping away the rights of innocent civilians who have nothing to do with this ongoing conflict. And that is one of those prevalent moral issues that drone usage in warfare and armed conflicts presents. I don't really want to go through point by point the argument points, because these will be available in an online treasury. But I do want to say definitely must study a little bit of the UN Charter with respect to proportionality of the military use of these. There's a chapter in the UN Charter which states that proportionality of military arms and weaponry have to be at the same rate as they were both in the beginning of the war, in the middle, and at the end. And one argument that people who are vehemently against it point out that the U.S. and its drone strike, in its quote-unquote war in Afghanistan, increased its military power during the war significantly, rebalancing the explicit symbol that they or outfit that they wear, or they don't have explicit showmanship of weapons conglomerately in an ongoing conflict. So we aren't in an armed conflict with the Taliban and Al Qaeda. We aren't in an armed conflict with Pakistan regarding the affairs of drone strikes there. So people on the con side will tend to argue that it violates the Geneva Conventions and Chapter 51 of the UN Charter with regards to the U.S. action there. Domestically, drones are being used to film movies. They're actually on retail. You can buy them for anywhere between $400 to $1,300. Remote controlled. You can not only remote control it with a sensor pad, but you can also watch what it's surveying through your iPad, which can prove to be a very, very imminent problem for people who want privacy. They're spying on their neighbors, or a spouse spying on their husband, tracking their car. I mean, you can fill it in there with any specific scenario.
With a Hellfire strike, of course.
With a Hellfire strike.
I caught you. You son of a bitch.
Yes.
Hey, we're recording this. No bees.
Sorry. Bees. We're bees. I hate bees.
Farmers are using it to survey their crops. Generally, of course, we were listening to that argument earlier that, is it really, that innovative, for them? Is it really helping them to, collect, have a faster pace with cultivating it, or are they just simply surveying it to see overall how their crop is doing? That has that question in mind. Various police departments across the United States are using it to help their forensics team in investigating crimes. All of this that I'm telling you guys about domestically was actually from a Time article regarding the rise of the drones. Very interesting cover story from February that I encourage you to read, not just for the sake of being more informed about this, but it's actually quite enjoyable and interesting commentary and dissemination of facts at the same time. They're just everywhere and will continue to be so for until our laws and our conventions are overhauled.
Until they catch up, at least.
Yeah. So I thank you all very, very much, and very, very informative. Thank you.
Anybody have questions for Ronnie?
You say there's a law in the UN, and I was trying to interpret this correctly. A law that says you can't boast your military power during an armed conflict.
You can't introduce innovations that will rebalance the proportionality that you began so at the beginning of a war.
It's more an effort to control the escalation of, to deter countries from engaging in asymmetrical warfare.
Yes.
To keep the nature of warfare pretty much standard so that both sides go into the battle with a predictable idea of what their opponents can and will utilize against them on the field of battle.
Isn't the whole idea of that battle to use something your opponent doesn't know about you?
Clearly, it does not fit with Sun Tzu in the Art of War. You are correct, sir. But for the purposes of the United Nations trying to minimize the scale of war escalating and drawing in, the UN was created after World War II as an effort to never again have a world war occur. That's largely the reasoning, is to control the outbreak and scope of warfare. But please go on. Sorry.
That was the least attended to argumentative point that I would our forefathers from previous generations saw after World War II that peace and soft power must be the primary mediation between countries, and that's why UN was formed as an argumentative point. And that foregoing, that should be the last argumentative point because it feeds into solutions that I felt con side could potentially use. That an international treaty overhauling Geneva and the UN Charter that will delineate express uses of drones, both domestically in countries, but also in how countries deal with each other in conflicts. And that either, of course, is having a treaty that still allots them, or saying that their usage has to end because the volatility of warfare occurring at any time and everyone living in a situation of fear. Does that deprive your right to life and liberty, essentially, around the world?
War totally violates rights.
Oh yeah.
Really? I was unaware of that.
Well, I mean, at least the UN tries to patch it up with humanitarian law.
Something like that.
In truth, there really is no way to civilize war. War itself, in itself, is uncivilized.
Well, I mean, but that's what the UN wanted to do, was if war was an inevitable component of human civilization, they wanted to make it as civilized as possible.
And that's a noble goal, but it's going to be hard to civilize war when people who generally start wars are uncivilized.
It's like trying to say we should get rid of killing.
Well, I would like to write a paper